Okay, so we've gone onto avid.com, and the first thing it's going to do if you attempt to download the free version of Media Composer first is actually prompt you to either sign in or create an account. It's free to do that with Avid, and it's very useful to have an account. Of course, you're going to need one to use the software. Once you've got the account and you're signed in, you can just download Media Composer first. And I should probably mention as well that there's a great comparison section on the Avid website that shows you the main differences between Media Composer First and the main version of Media Composer. But don't worry too much about that now, because really we're just going to start implementing the basics of editing and learn the why more than the how. And the reason that we try and aim to use Media Composer over everything else as a non-linear editor choice is just because of its power and its scale when it comes to working at large formats. I just want to mention one of these reasons now, which is called Script Sync. And this is a feature where it actually links all of the text from a script into the actual clips that you've got in your bin. And it's really smart, and you can actually click on the various lines of your script and it will bring up the source clip in your source monitor within Media Composer. This might not seem like a big deal, but if you're working particularly on documentary, you might not always have the script in mind, or it might only become clear as the edit begins what the general flow of the story will be, usually through the audio, which is called a radio edit. So this sort of feature allows you to really deal with huge amounts of footage where, if it's documentary, for example, the story isn't necessarily clear in terms of the order from the outset. And it's these little features that make Media Composer so important at that bigger level when you're dealing with so many clips and rushes on a daily basis. That being said, I'm just going to direct your attention to where the clips for today's exercise are. I've put them in the post-production folder on the server, and I'm accessing it now remotely from home using the VPN. So my VPN is connected, and that allows me to reach the post-production folder on the server, and I use these little triangles to expand, and I've got a folder called Jacuzzi, which contains some rushes that we can use to get to grips with Media Composer. So if you click on the 007 folder, you get all the files there, and you can go ahead and download them as per the Edit Share Online guide on the Moodle Mask. If you're not familiar, I would just point you to the Moodle Mask all the time. Avid Link is really your interface to Avid, which is where you get a lot of information and you get your product updates from this page. So you're going to need to sign in there to your Avid account and have that running in the background before you can launch Media Composer. So I've been using some cuts of this footage, and I've already got my project laid out here to show you some of these editing principles and techniques. But before I dive into that, I'm just going to close this project down, and I'm going to start from scratch with you so that we're on the same page. So I'm going to close my project there, and because this is Media Composer first, the home screen is a bit different, this project select screen, a bit different to the full version of Media Composer, but that's okay. All the basic tools that we need are already right there. So we just need to enter in a new project name. I'm going to call this MC Project. Perhaps I'll put the date in as well, but for now I'll just put Project Test. The project location is really important. You're going to want to point that to your Avid Media Composer projects folder, and that could be on the server or on a hard drive, but it shouldn't be local on a machine. So I'm just going to point it to my folder, which is on a personal hard drive, and that's where all my Avid projects live. So if you've already got projects up and running, it's going to list them here. After you connect the project location, it's going to show you those projects in that location. And with Media Composer, we don't actually need to manually create individual project folders because it manages it for us. We just need to link the project location. So here's my project location here. It's on my hard drive in Avid MC project. So if I go back here and just select the folder, then that's all I need to do. And that location is there set. It's kind of grayed out, it's hard to see, but I can then create a new project in that space there. So my keyboard layout might be different if I don't have my user profile set. That's okay. All these things are changeable afterwards. Because don't warn me again if that happens. When you create a new project in Media Composer, you will have a bin and a sequence auto-generated with the name of the project. And that's just to help you get started so that you don't have to create your own bins and sequences. So I'll just give you a rough overview of how things appear to be before we launch into our edit and start to discover the nuances of how to work towards that suspension of disbelief for the narrative. Up in the upper left, we've got our bin container. This is where all of our bins, or they could be folders, live. Folders are essentially folders that hold bins. If we want to have bins within folders, we can't have bins within bins. And if we double click on a bin, we actually get the bin itself here. So we can see we've got nothing in the clips bin at the moment. And if I double click on sequences, it's automatically made a sequence for us in the sequence bin there. Now we can close these. They don't disappear or anything. It's just closing our view of those bins. So like I say, we can have the bins open or closed. If we just double click on the icon, we can get them back and we can rearrange. If we have several bins open at the same time, we can click a tab and we can drag it and we can park it. Then we can do like a split screen thing. And this is really handy if we have material that we want to move from one bin to another. If you're the sort of editor who likes to make a bin for even all of your in-out points, you could do that by clicking and dragging around. Or you might want to change, you might want to archive sequences into an archive bin, for example. So that's pretty handy, and that comprises of the bin container, and the bin comprises the bin section of Media Composer, which is that entire upper left-hand corner. Here, the two windows are called the Composer window. So we've got our source monitor with the green scrubber and our record, which is blue. So what we see on the record monitor is going to exactly mirror what happens in the timeline with our sequence. So if we have a sequence going on, we'll see that the position of it will match the little blue bar, and you'll see that in a moment. Now the buttons and also the timecode values on each monitor are specific to that monitor. So here we've got some markers, we've got clear markers, in and out, for example, and we've got our splice in and override buttons. That all applies to actually selecting the right section of video in the source monitor. And the buttons under the record monitor refer to the behavior on the timeline itself. So before we go any further, we're just going to start to organize our bin container a bit better and our bins themselves. So you can close the bins before we start reordering things. It says test clips here. Well, let's just rename that rushes. All of our rushes will go in there. We can rename this one, for example, sequences. And then if we want to, we can make, let's say, a new folder and call it imports. I can select the folder and then I can right click on the icon and say new bin, and it will actually generate the bin within the folder. So for example, in imports, I might have music. I might have VFX. And if it doesn't generate it in the folder, you can click and drag into that folder. And I also might have, I've reached my maximum number of bins with Media Composer. First, 5 bins. where is my fifth bin? Oh, it's in the trash. So can I remove it from the trash? Is that bringing me over my number of 5? If I try and delete that from the trash, I can just empty the trash. And then hopefully I will get my fifth bin. So import, let's say we're going to go for sound effects, because temp sounds and music even are both really important to put in the rough edit. Don't leave that to later on, because you really want to get a good sense of the pacing and the timing and the flow and all that rhythm stuff. Really important to start working with that from the outset, even in your rough cut. So now I've got rushes, sequences, and I've got music, sound effects, and some video effects in the imports bin. Before I go any further, I just want to draw your attention to, or remind you, you already know hopefully, of the fact that on the Moodle page for Media Arts Skills Center, we've got a practical submission guide that explains to you how we like to have the videos submitted to us. It's basically like a broadcaster would give you a kind of specification order, if you like, so that you know this is what is being asked of you when you submit a piece of practical work. And you can now actually work remotely, which is really nice. But the bit that I'm drawing your attention to is the fact that we need idents and end slates, which is essentially a 15-second cushion with text that tells us that your video follows certain technical specifications, and we're able to identify the candidate number and that information from the video burnt into that 15-second ident. And at the very end, we put in the end slate, which allows us to make sure that the video has held synchronization between the picture and the sound over the course of your work. And the duration, by the way, counts from your first frame of action on the timeline, not from the start of the title. Now, have a read through of that so that makes more sense. And there's some great information there on aspect ratios as well. And it even mentions a bit about how to export in Premiere, but we're going to be using Media Composer today. The title and end slate, they're actually here for you on the Moodle mask. If you scroll down to the digital workflow section, you can download those assets there. Also, we have those assets in the post-production course folder under countdowns and idents. You can see that I'm remotely looking at the files here, and it's just a counter that we're going to use the text tool to put some information of our file over there. And we've got some beeps that help us check whether or not we're staying in sync. This is a little 2 frames of video with a little 1 kilohertz beeping tone, so that we can see really clearly in the edit how our sync is doing. So the first step, I would say, would be to get those files into the imports folder, let's say the VFX bin. So I'm just going to try and close my other bins. And to import footage in Media Composer, it's file input source browser. So I've got those materials downloaded into my hard drive, and I'm just going to point to them here. It's my Avid MC projects folder. So here I've got my ident and my end slate, and I'm going to make a contiguous selection using Control-click, and I am leaving it on link because we don't import. That's not the way we show you how to use Media Composer, because it's prone to confusion and transcoding errors. So always make sure that's linked, and the target bin is going to be the VFX bin. And as we're here, I can show you that if I use the J, K, and L keys, I can actually preview the videos in the source browser, which is really cool because it allows you to whittle down, let's say, bad takes or clips that you don't need before you actually bring them into Media Composer. So Control or Command click if it's a Mac, I can select multiple, press link, and then they appear in my source bin there. I'm going to close the source browser. The clips are showing here, and I can use shortcuts to change the view of these in the bin. And you can see the shortcut that I'm using in the bottom right of the screen. Pretty cool. So we also need to get our rushes in. That's really important. Obviously, we've got nothing to work on otherwise. So let's do the same. File, input, source browser. And we'll point to where the rushes live. Like I say, it's Jacuzzi folder. And I've got them all in there. And I've got the script as well, but I don't need that for this exercise. So I'm going to link all those clips. It takes a moment. It's saying the script cannot be imported. So that's fine. I'll just press no on that. And you might have a few more settings on that import browser, by the way, in the full version of Media Composer, but it's okay. It doesn't matter for now. Now we've got all of our master clips in our bin indicated by this master clip icon, and we can see this link icon here indicating that these are all linked master clips. They're in list view, but they're not in the right order. So to do that, we just need to click on the name and right click and sort on ascending. And now the clips have gone into the right order. But if I go back into the frame view, it doesn't show us the clips in a very kind of, obvious way. So if you just right click in the bin, I should say generally as well that right clicking is something that you do to try and get extra options in settings. And depending on where you right click, you get different options pertaining to that area of the software. So you can right click in the bin container, right click in the bin, right click in the source monitor, in the record monitor, and on the timeline, which will give you timeline options, timeline settings down there. In addition to right clicking, each area has what's called a fast menu, which are the two little bars on the corner of that area. And they also give you additional settings. So you've got that extra layer of control. So usually you can find things pertaining to the bin, the composer, and the timeline areas by focusing on right-clicking that area or the fast menu of that area. And you've also got the master settings, by the way, and this is a different shortcut whether or not you're on Windows or Windows or Mac. But for Windows, it's Control-Shift equals, which is a nice key press on the keyboard. For Mac, it's Command, comma, and that is how you reach the master settings. I'll come back to the clip view in a second. I just want to make sure I'm covering some basics here. In the Media Composer First, the free version, you don't necessarily have user profiles. In the full paid version of Media Composer, you've got the option to have different user profiles. So you can have different users with different keyboard configurations and different interface settings. But that's okay on the free version. We can still configure our keyboard just the way we like it. And to do that, you just double click on the keyboard. The one that you've got ticked is the one that is active because you can have different keyboard setups and you can switch between them here. Even though you don't get user profiles in the free version, you can still swap between different setups depending on maybe who's using the computer, if that's useful to you. And to do that, if you press the shortcut Control 3, which is Command 3 on a Mac, you get the command palette. All of these shortcuts, by the way, are in the shortcut guide that is on the course page, the Avid shortcut guide, which is really useful, and I would say you should always have that open while you're using Media Composer. But I've simply added some extra buttons here. For example, the Go to Previous Event button and the Go to Next Event button I've put on the comma and period keys because I really like having those as shortcuts, and I don't necessarily need those keys to be doing the single frame trim, which is what they normally do. So I'm going to just maybe recommend that's a nice one to map because it maps them onto the bracket keys of your actual physical keyboard. It's very easy to see where that is. But really importantly, I would say are the G shortcut, which is clearing marks, H, which is adding edits, T, which is marking, and then you've got some additional ones along here for trim mode. P, bracket, changes which sides of the trim you're making. Now this is more advanced stuff we'll come to later on, but I and O, J, K, and L, they're really the 5 most important keys for any editing application, which is why the neighboring keys are very important because your fingers should be resting on these J, K, and L keys, which go back, stop, or pause and play forward. And then you can really easily, without even looking, you can just move your index fingers or your pinky to other neighboring keys, which is why the vicinity of the J, K, and L is where all the most important shortcuts reside. The J, K, and L keys, by the way, are dynamic, which means you can hold the K and you can tap J to go back frame by frame, or you can double tap back and forward and it will go quickly. So they're really smart keys, which is why your right hand if you're left-handed, or your left hand if you're right-handed, is going to be on those 3 keys at all times. And audio ducking is a nice new feature, and you've got keyframes nearby. So everything is nice and close here, but really importantly, I want those previous and next event keys to be right under, which is why I like to have them there. If you wanted to, you can actually leave the keyboard open while you're working in Media Composer, which is a quite nice way to just remind yourself where everything is. But back to the bin, we can right click in the bin and we can actually hide this bin map, because it's a bit distracting if it's actually covering the clips. Depends how you like to work, but we can hide the bin map, and we can tell it to fill the window with the clips, or we can say fill sorted if it's not actually showing them in the same order as the list that we've defined here. So the fill sorted will make sure that the thumbnail view always obeys this text mode. And now we've got all of our rushes in there. We can use our zoom in shortcut, which on PC control K and L, on Mac it's command K and L, and we can obviously preview the clips there by selecting one and using the J, K and L keys, and you should get audio as well. Again, that's really useful for just double checking what the clips are doing, and you can leave a clip at a certain representative frame and you'll kind of get a sense for what's going on, because you may or may not have the slate in the shot there. And obviously to get it into the composer monitor, you just double click it, and then you can start setting your in-out points really easily by using J, K and L.
And set.
And action.
Finding the first frame after action, pressing I, and then roughly you're going to see the end of it. Press O, and then that's going to splice in or overwrite to the timeline. If you don't have a timeline, it's going to prompt you to make one. And this is the main difference between Media Composer First and the full version, is that the frame rate, which is the most important thing of your entire project, is going to take from the source clip in Media Composer First, whereas in the full version you must set that in advance. So we're always going to stick to 25 frames a second, and this is a HD project. So the very first thing that needs to go to your timeline is the actual title ident. Let's just make sure we have a sequence generated. We do. I'm going to double click it, and here we have our sequence. I can rename it rough cut, for example. Oh, a bit of a typo there. And I should get, if I don't set the in-out marks, I will get the entire clip to the timeline if I just patch it straight away. Now you can see I patched it there without really doing anything in the main timeline. And these idents, they're stereo clips, which means you've got a left and right channel of audio, meaning that the audio is going to land on a stereo channel, which is why it hasn't gone to A1 or A2. But essentially, whether or not you've got a mono or stereo clip will determine where it lands. Don't worry too much about that now, but we just want to get our ident in onto the timeline so we can see what we're working with. And it would be quite nice to see the frame there, just so that we know what exact frame we're looking at. So in our fast menu for the timeline, we've got the option to show the clip frames. And we can, of course, change the height of the tracks, and the shortcut is the same one as what changes the height of the thumbnails in the bin as well, in our rushes bin. So depending on where we click and select, we'll get the height affect our timeline versus our bins. And you can see I'm using the Smart tool here. I like to edit with the Smart tool enabled. It used to be down there, and they've moved it in the new version. And having these two enabled just means that you can go into segment mode or ripple mode very easily, depending on where the cursor is highlighted. And we'll get more into that shortly. But just to show you now that if I hover over the first top half of the clip, it's going to be red, and the bottom half is going to be yellow. And that is really important because the color scheme determines whether or not things move around on the timeline in terms of the neighboring clips as you move your target clip around. The red will just keep things locked off, and it's going to overwrite when you move clips around, but the yellow is going to splice it in, and it's going to potentially reorder or retime neighboring footage in terms of its duration on the timeline. So just be aware of that. Also, you can see I've got the waveforms visible on the timeline. You might not have that if you don't have that button selected, and it actually lives in this disclosure triangle here next to the time code. That's where you've got the option to turn on the waveform, and if you hold Option or Alt on PC, it's going to turn on for all of the tracks, and it's the same shortcut that you can use to turn the clips into clip gain mode. For example, if you want to have some more further control over their volume as well, you can put it in volume mode, and you can actually punch in keyframes as well. So we'll come to that shortly, but for now it's just nice to get our title ident in there, and that's sort of slightly blocking the time code. If you look carefully, you can see that the time code isn't necessarily correct because this title ident piece is 15 seconds long, and we want our first frame of action to be at the 1 hour point. That comes from the days of film, where the first reel of film will be dumped on the 1 hour mark, the second reel of film on the 2 hour mark, and so on. Here we need to offset the starting time code to be -15 of the first frame, which is on 1 hour, so that our 15-second of ident finishes on the 1 hour mark. And to do that, it's not necessarily obvious, but we have to right click in the record monitor, which is also the timeline. I'll just show you that as you move it around on the timeline, it moves around here on the record monitor scrubber as well, because they're essentially the same thing. This is the timeline up here. That's what the timeline is. If you make a in-out selection on the timeline, let's say, it's going to mirror that up here because it is the same thing, and that can be confusing at the start. So G to clear the marks. So yeah, I was going to show you that to set the time code, it's actually in the sequence report section. This is where we do that. What we're doing here is we're looking to change the time code, the starting time code of the sequence, so that it's actually 59:45:00. So that means 00 hours. Oh, that's not, didn't want to change there. Strange. 00 hours, 59 minutes, 45 seconds, and 00 frames, 25 frames in a second. That means that once we apply these changes, watch what happens to the time code on the rulers when I press apply. So now you can see that, maybe if I zoom out, I'm going to use control bracket, which is my zoom control. It makes it a lot easier to see what's going on. We can see the title slate ends exactly on the 1 hour point, which is really nice. This is where our FFOA, our first frame of action, is going to start. So we get a 2-second black handle before that, so that it's very obvious in the broadcasting sense when the first frame begins. So that's how you get the title ident in there, and you can use the text tool just by clicking on T there. If you actually select the clip first, then press the text tool, the titler will write onto the clip. You have to use this T box in the text field, and then you can actually write your candidate number and so forth as per the practical submission guide on Moodle Mask. So that's where you go about entering all of your information onto the video. Now, it's not the best practice to be writing onto the video itself. What's better off is to, if you control Y to make a new video track, or Command Y on a Mac, you can actually enter text on a filler piece of video. So in Media Composer, filler can be treated in the same way as an actual clip of video. So we can add titles and text to a piece of filler. And if we wanted to, we can also add a piece of timecode overlay onto the filler just to keep us crystal clear on what's going on. So if I press Control 8 or it's Command 8 on a Mac, I can search for timecode, and then I can add that effect onto the filler, and I should have timecode visible on the record monitor. And the reason that I don't is a little banana skin. The video monitor button is set to V1, which is our bottommost layer of video. So only things below this blue video monitor will be displayed, meaning I have to click that on the uppermost layer where I want timecode. And you can see there the timecode has appeared. But to be honest with you, I'm going to build my timeline out before I do that. Just to draw your attention as well to the fact that Media Composer needs the video tracks patched before you make that splice overwrite. It's really quite important to get that right, because you're going to have some issues with the video appearing and the audio appearing somewhere where you haven't necessarily planned. So the track patching is really important. And all of these clips here, if I get one back in the source monitor, these are mono channels. So you can see the audio patch went back to our A1, which is mono channel, as soon as I selected it. So Media Composer knows if the source is audio or stereo, and it might auto patch accordingly. Now there's some buttons on the keyboard that will help you automatically make the patches if that's your preferred way of working. So in other words, you can select and deselect video tracks just by using the keyboard, or you can click on them and it will select them, or you can click and drag to manually patch a track. So I usually go for V1 as my main video layer, and with V2 I can overlay perhaps some cutaway shots or some reverse shots or reaction shots, and I sometimes mute those if I'm not sure about them, and I have a look at them later on. So I'll show you that in a moment. Right now we just want to generally go about building the timeline, and I'm going to start using these buttons here, which are next event and previous event. Super handy buttons that just snap to where the cuts are, because it saves you fishing for the cut manually frame by frame. I mean, if you want to, you can press left and right and it's going to go frame by frame, but I like to use these. It just snaps bang onto where I want it to be. So with all of our main editing principles in mind, we're going to start getting this story down in a continuous way and work towards what's called a rough cut, which is where we might present our work to someone else like the director to get some feedback before we proceed. But we have to obviously get everything onto the timeline and start refining. And we do so as per the shortcut guide that I've made, is on the Moodle page for the course. I want to refer to what I've put at the top here, which are what I call the pillars, the real 5 things that you do when you edit in terms of the function. You're adding to the timeline, you're removing from the timeline, you're reordering the clips on the timeline, you're trimming on the timeline, and then you're slipping. So the last 2 or 3 are really when you start refining that timeline. The first couple are just basically compiling the clips, stringing them out towards a rough edit. But this really here, reordering, trimming, and slipping, is when you really start to get into the detail, the nuance, frame by frame of what's happening when you make those fine level adjustments. So bear that in mind. It's all on the shortcut, the top of the shortcut guide that's on the Moodle course page, and then you've got all the most useful shortcuts that I'll be using throughout the course of the next few steps. But it's all there for you to check out, and I would say go through these. For example, tab shift. There's some really useful ones that you just need to make yourself comfortable with, and these are written for Mac, I'll say, but they're usually similar on PC. You just swap out command for control and you get the same result. So that being said, let's let's get some footage to the timeline. I'm just going to see what I've got here. Now you should be familiar with this footage.
Delivery!
So we've got our delivery that takes place almost against the main character's wishes. He doesn't really seem to want to engage with the delivery. He doesn't seem really bothered. And that's the real crux of this story. And the footage is slightly strange in that sense because it doesn't necessarily give us a clear vision for how to shape this, which is why it's good tutorial footage to use, because we're going to try and give it meaning through the edit. So I'm going to set an in and an out point. It lingers quite a bit here after he's knocked, so that's fine for now. I can splice it in or I can overwrite. Splicing in will insert the footage and push the neighboring clips down the timeline, therefore changing the length of the timeline and changing the time code that the clips appear on the timeline. Whereas overwriting will just stamp it straight down. It will just completely overwrite what's underneath. And those colors are also referring to when you remove footage from the timeline. So if I make a selection, I'm going to press T to mark the clip. And depending on whether or not you use the link button, deselect, the two clips will, the audio and the video will both be selected if you're using the link selection toggle button. So knowing how to use that is pretty handy. G is clear selection. So if you ever need to just make sure that you've got no in-out point set. So if I want to remove this from the timeline, I have to make sure that I'm selecting both. So use the link button there, and then you can press delete to remove. Or if you want to be more careful, more professional, you can press the T button. It marks the timeline in, out, and then you can either lift or extract. And I really think those tools should be red and yellow, because when you press extract, it will change the timeline because it's a yellow type of tool. It's going to change the neighboring clips. Remember, yellow means caution, moving objects. Red means it's a static tool. So if I were to use the lift, which is like a red tool, let me just give you a better example. Maybe selecting here instead, I'm going to lift that out. Because it's a red tool, nothing moves on the timeline because it's a static tool. Whereas if I was to cut it, which is a yellow tool, boom, it moves the timeline and it potentially causes some sync issues depending on the track selection. Track selection is really important because it will only remove or add depending on the track selection. So as you can see there, you might have some sync issues if you're not aware of the tracks being selected properly. So just keep an eye on that. We also have these sync locks. So these prevent things from going out of sync. If you're not being diligent with your track selection, the sync locks will save you from things slipping. But the sync locks can discourage your awareness of track selection. So these are all things that we'll hopefully look at in practice as we make our way through this exercise. So for now, we've made the IO selection and we've pushed it to the timeline. So we've made an additive function there, and I've just shown you how to remove it. So those are the basic tools there. So we've got audio there, we've got the knocks on the door, we've got the delivery man saying he's got a parcel. And what I want to do is I want to insert some shots of this gentleman looking over his shoulder as this delivery is taking place. So let's say I want to utilize different segments of this footage. I'm going to target the V2 track so that I can just have a bit more control about where these in-out points land on the timeline, and I can move things around on the V2 track knowing that that's a kind of reaction shot. I'm going to find the point where he first turns around, set my mark there, and let's say, because remember I'm inserting it over, I don't want to necessarily replace anything on the underlying clip. I'm just going to insert this, and because I have A1 selected, even though there's no source audio, it actually writes nothing because there's no source audio over the A1 track, and it kind of ruins the sound for that section. So watch out for that. That's a great example of when you've got a track selected on the timeline. It could be an audio track, and the actual patch that you make to the timeline, it writes nothing, or essentially erases a part of your track. So make sure that you disable that, because Media Composer doesn't necessarily know if you want to have your source video audio landing on any given track. So it basically does what you instruct it to based upon the track selections, which are really important. So I'm going to, now that I've just got the V2 selected, overwrite that portion to V2, and that doesn't interfere with the underlying sound. Because this shot is motor only sound, there's no audio here, so I know that I can play with it a bit more over the underlying footage. So if I play it back now,
Delivery!
you know, I can create this sense that
Delivery!
he's being disturbed, but we're still hearing the underlying sound. Let me just zoom the tracks a bit. I don't really need to see the stereo tracks, so I'm just going to zoom vertically using Control L. And it's just a bit easier to kind of select between the static and moving smart tools. I want to move the clip, so I'm going to make sure I select the simple arrow and not the roller tool. So this is like a scroll type shape, which is for changing the edges, rolling on the edge of the clip, expanding the film, or rolling it away. And if I go for the yellow side, which is the lower half, that's going to perform in a time dynamic way, which again could cause you problems depending on what else you've got selected. So just playing with those is the best way to become familiar with the difference between how they behave. And the undo shortcut is your best friend. I mean, you can always just undo. I should probably mention as well, there's a really good tip about your timeline. So this is my timeline that I'm using here. It's called blank. I can just duplicate this very easily by just doing Control D, which is the standard duplicate command on Windows, or it would be Command D on Mac. And I can double click on the new duplicate timeline. Let's say I want to experiment and do something else. Well, I can always then have that original to go back to, as long as you're aware of which sequences, which timelines you're actually working off. Okay, so that's how easy it is to duplicate timelines. And I can delete that by just pressing delete, then delete sequence. I should mention as well that the best way in Media Composer to save all of your work is to click in the bin container, so that that's the area of the software that's selected, and then Control Save. If you only click in a bin and save, let's say you make a superficial change, let's say blank, edit. We've got this asterisk showing you that our sequences bin has a pending change that hasn't been saved. Let's say we change something in another bin, for example. We'll get that asterisk in the other bin as well. But if I only save by clicking in the bin and then pressing save, it's only going to save that individual bin. It's not going to save our other work in the other bins. So be very careful with that. The only way, the best way to save everything is by, well, you could go to File, Save All, but you have to make sure that you've selected the bin container first, and then it will save everything in the bin container, which is all your work in all the bins. And the bins, by the way, can be moved between projects. That's a really great way to make kind of a master edit from individual scenes, for example. And you can actually do that by copying the bin files in the actual folder of the project. You can actually copy the bin files. See here we have Avid bin files. We can actually copy and paste those into different project folders, and the bins will appear in different projects, which is really, really cool. A great way to build up a really fluid master edit from individual scenes or various sub-edit projects. And another way of doing it might be, you might have sub-edit sequences, and then you've got a master sequence. They're just extra layers of functionality, different options for you to consider when you're compiling your edit together. So back to my timeline. Let's say I want to capture the reaction here. Let's say this is a basic example of cutting on action. I want to make sure that for every cut that I make, there's motivation there. So it starts out a very kind of still scene, which is ruined by the delivery man's voice and disturbing this this scene here.
Delivery.
Maybe I don't want to have him turning around so slowly, so I can tidy that up fairly easily by just hovering over the corner and using the red tool here, the red roller. I can change where that clip comes in. Okay, so this is where your timing really comes into play, and your awareness of the exact moment of the video cut versus the picture.
Delivery.
You know, if I change where that video cut comes in, according to the sound, it will have extra impact and fluidity, and it won't distract me too much from the story.
Delivery. Delivery.
So have a play with where that falls. Notice what happens when we see him before hearing the audio.
Delivery. Delivery.
We get this sense that he's in a zone, and it's less of an interruption, whereas if I move it to be during the line of spoken dialogue, and then we cut to him moving.
Delivery.
It's more of an interruption. It's slightly more jarring. So I think a nice point for this might be in between the knocking and the words delivery.
Delivery. Delivery.
Have a play with that. See what you think works. It's all about that motivation. And he turns his head. We don't want to go back to the same shot because we've already seen that shot and it's not cutting on action. So what can we do here to spice things up? Well, the great thing about having a video cut over audio is that you can use it as coverage to make underlying cuts. So what I mean by that is, as he's looking over his shoulder, we can actually make a cut on this layer, and we can just sort of get to the point a bit faster because we don't want this to drag too much. So what I'll do here is select A1 and V1. I'm not going to have V2 selected. I'm going to use my go-to buttons. I'm going to use my shortcut H, which is make an edit, add edit there. Should add an edit to this section here. And now I can ripple edit this clip here so that the delivery driver is already at the window when it makes that cut. Let me just expand this clip as well a bit more. I'm just going to press exit to enter trim mode. Don't worry about trim mode is basically when the source and record monitor changes function to show you the adjacent frames either side of the cut. And you know it's in trim mode because well, you might have pressed U to go into trim mode and it goes purple there. The source monitor changes, but importantly you get the dual purple roller, and that is allowing you to change the point at which the two clips combine. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that, but I need to make sure that when the character looks back to the window, something is different about that shot. It's evolved because we're cutting on action. We don't want to get stuck in a very kind of slow edit. So because I've got this shot of the gentleman looking around the chair as cover, I can then make a cut on the underlying footage, which is the delivery. Here, as you can see, the shot of the window. So I'm going to use this shot here as coverage. I'm going to go back to the window. I'm going to try and find the point where it's kind of evolved or it's developed. So I'm going to press I-O, let's say here, go to my edit point in the timeline using the keys, the bracket keys, and I'm going to override it to the timeline so that we get blank window, reaction, back to window, and something has changed because we're cutting on action. So let's have a listen.
I see you there, boss.
So he sees him and there's a little wave. So I could use the yellow rolling edit tool to trim it down so that it's snappier. And
delivery. I see you there, boss.
Yeah, that's a bit quick, so I can just roll and expand that there, and eventually
Delivery. I see you there, boss.
we get a nice kind of sense of timing, rhythm, and pacing and flow there. Nothing's happening too quickly. It's not too jarring. Now I want to get another shot of his reaction to the delivery man, because we've just seen his initial face and turn establishing him, but we don't have anything showing his reaction. So let's see what we've got here. We've got a little wave. It's already marked, I believe. So I'm going to put that again on V2, because I'm using this as a kind of a reaction shot track. I just quite like to checkerboard in that way sometimes. So let's overwrite it. I don't want to splice it in because I want the timings underlying to remain accurate. Let's have a look.
I see you there, boss.
Yeah, so that works fine. I don't need to ping pong too much. It'll start to get a bit stale. So I'm going to use my control modifier, by the way, so that I can free move that clip anywhere in the timeline. Just double check it again.
Delivery. I see you there, boss.
Okay, so let's just make sure we've covered all the basics now. We've added to the timeline. We've removed by selecting and pressing delete, being aware of track selection, or by marking, which we can do with the T key and using the cut or extract. I call it cut because it's a scissors. Extract or lift. And we can actually reorder things as well if we want to. Let me just run you through how to do that. Again, because we've got the Smart tool selected, our function changes depending on where we're hovering. So you might have seen me move the clips around using the red tool on the top half of the segment. But if I actually go in the bottom half, I get a yellow tool. So instead of just overwrite moving the clip, which is what the red tool does because it's static, I can hover over the yellow half and it doesn't overwrite, it rearranges. So that's a crucial difference between the two colors. And I can just right click on the timeline. I just want to show you very quickly that we have some timeline settings here that are quite important. On the edit tab, the default segment tool behavior can be defined here. So the default segment tool is going to overwrite. So like I say, that gets overridden based upon the fact that we've got the Smart tool selected. Because we have the Smart tool, these segment tools are on both red and yellow mode. It overrides any default. It just means that we've got the option to do everything from one tool depending on where we hover the mouse. So that's the way that I like to edit with the Smart tool turned on both red and yellow mode. It just overrides any default, and it means that we are in full control of everything from the timeline without having to go and change the mode of the Smart tool the whole time. So if I want to swap the clips around, I can just use the yellow function and that will reorder. See, the clips have been reordered. So we've spoken about adding, removing from the timeline, reordering from the timeline, and we want to discuss now the final two functions of editing, which are trimming and slipping. So you've seen me trim already. Trimming is just the art of refining the edge of the frame to change where the frame ends, and we can do that again in a static red way or in a time dynamic yellow way. So that's essentially what trimming is. You're going into this trim mode whereby the source and record monitors change. They go into this mode here where it's showing you what frame you're going from and to, and it shows you the trim controls under here. And crucially, you can change which part of the frame you're trimming with the keyboard, because targeting which section you're trimming can be a bit fidgety. You've got three main options. The default option is by pressing the key to the right of the P key, which is here. This trims the AB sides, which is the sides of both clips together. So if I was to either use my J, K, and L to play here and then press stop, look what's happened. It's made a trim there because I'm in trim mode. I've got both sides selected and I'm using these J, K, and L keys to make that trim. And I can do that very slowly if I want to as well, by holding and tapping. I don't need to do it in real time. So a really great tool there. And I can use the keys to the left and right of this bracket key, which are P and the other bracket, to change the side of the clip that I'm working on. I can just work on the A side, just work on the B side, or work on both keys, both sides together. And I can also click and drag the mouse. Trimming is really important and really powerful in Media Composer, and it's the real reason to use Media Composer, because you can really refine your edit, and you can actually click different segments of different videos on different tracks, and you can actually trim multiple tracks at the same time. So it gets quite advanced if you wanted to, but you don't need to do that. I'm just showing you that this is the real power of Media Composer. And you can press escape to get out of trim mode, and it will take you back to the normal source record, where you've got no special purple buttons appearing here, and it's not highlighting on any rollers. I should also point out that when you make a marquee selection on clips, it should select the clips there. However, to deselect, you just click away, or you can click in the ruler and it will deselect as well. If you want to select the trim points of a clip, notice what happens if you make the marquee selection the other way. It goes into trim mode. So I tend not to use the U shortcut, which is the toggle trim shortcut, toggle trim mode, because I can just highlight, I can click and drag backwards on the timeline, and that actually gives us our trim mode on whatever we're selecting. Now it can be a bit fiddly if you're trying to, make a selection there on a trim roller, but if you actually make the selection on the clip, it can kind of go wrong, and I've knocked my clips out of sync, as indicated by the tiny little blue text here on the video clip showing me that I'm 388 and 114 clips out of sync. So just be careful with that, which is why sometimes I just like to click on the clip boundaries and then it goes into trim mode. See that? You can just do it that way. And if you hold shift, you can make contiguous selections across different tracks. So you can use the combination of the U key to go into the nearest trim point. You can click on the trim points individually and shift click them, or you can reverse marquee them. Notice what happens when I reverse marquee an entire segment. It highlights the clip boundaries in purple on both the in and the out point of the clip. And this brings us to our last of the 5 editing kind of pillars, which are add, remove, reorder, trim, and slip. Now it's in slip mode, so I can play and I'm slipping the clip. See that? So slipping is essentially where the duration of the clip and the timeline doesn't change, but the content of the clip moves. Let me just show you this on this clip here. It'll be a bit easier to see what's happening. So you don't always have to do the marquee selection because things can go wrong sometimes. You can just select the clip and press U, and that will go into trim mode. So now I can use J, K, and L, and I can play this clip. And see what happened? It's changing the contents, where the contents is with the play keys. But once the trim finishes, it doesn't actually change the position of the clip or the duration of the clip in the timeline. So slipping is really handy if you just want to shift along the contents of what the clip is doing without changing the mechanics of the timeline. So I'm not going to do the whole edit. I've just now outlined the 5 sort of main tools of how to achieve all those editing functions to work towards the editing principles. I'm going to leave it to you to go ahead and cut up the timeline using these tools and techniques. And just bear in mind that you're going to want to make the best use of this footage as possible. You're being inventive, you're being careful with the pacing and the timing, you're cutting on action where possible, you're moving the story along. And you may find that the footage is a bit thin in terms of coverage when it goes to the point where he actually answers the door. I would have thought we would have a nice kind of sheepish shot of him opening the door, but it's just a bit too, kind of straightforward. So you might have to be a bit inventive of how you kind of string this section to the next bit working towards the end. So I'm going to leave you to that for now. Go ahead and crack on with the edit. In the meantime, I'm going to show you, if you want to, you can pause the video, feel free. I'm going to move on now to show you different ways of covering a conversation for different dramatic effect.